Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome. Today we're lucky to have Julia Pawlenty with us today to talk about a topic which is pretty important to veterans. Even though I don't suffer PTSD, I don't think. My wife probably says I do, but it's a problem nowadays where they actually start thinking about suicide, and there are suicide instances across the country, and Julie's going to talk about that a little bit today. But Julie's with the VA, Minnesota VA, and she's responsible for this program, or one of many, I guess, but I think you're the chief, right?
I am one of the coordinators in the program, yeah.
Chief coordinators in the program for this. And her topic today is signs, ask, validate, encourage, and expedite. And it deals with military retired people's possible suicide. So with that, Julie Pawlenty.
Good morning. Should I use both microphones? Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you, John, and thank you all for having me today. As he shared, my name is Julia Pawlenty, and I am a clinical social worker at the VA hospital in Minneapolis. I am also a resident here of Cannon Falls, a transplant. So I moved to Cannon about 4.5 years ago. So I have kiddos in the community as well, and I just think it's, I thank John just, for his passion for the topic and really, the coordination, getting me out here into the community where we can have these hard conversations. Suicide impacts all of us. If we haven't been impacted yet, it's likely we know somebody who has, or we will be impacted at some point. And so though I come from the VA hospital, I really come also as a member of your community. And so, I really hope today, during our 30, 40 minutes together, that we can have a conversation about suicide. Again, it impacts every single one of us. And so by having the conversation, keeping the topic on the forefront of our mind, we can help to intervene and prevent suicide from happening. So, briefly before I jump in, our program was implemented in 2007. So every VA in the country does have a suicide prevention program. So my program out of Minneapolis, we cover the medical center as well as the 13 community-based clinics in our area. So our closest cluster. And so every provider in the VA hospital and clinic receives some sort of training around suicide. We know that it's often not the mental health provider who's the receiver of the information when someone's in crisis. So we want everyone to have a level of comfort, competence in their ability to have these hard conversations. We also work, within the medical center to ensure that we are using evidence-based practices, right? That we are assessing veterans during every encounter when they're showing up. We also are out in our communities in instances such as this to ensure that we provide the community with resources, tools, and education. There are 20 vets that die by suicide every single day. 14 of those 20 are not registered with the VA healthcare system. So the majority of our veterans that die by suicide are not walking through the doors of the VA. So it is our job to get out into the community in front of their family, friends, employers, community, to ensure that we know what to look for, we know where to refer, that we all have a level of comfort in having these hard conversations. So I'm going to share a few numbers with you here today, and then we're going to dive into what's called VA Save. And so really it's, the pieces of information that we really encourage people to gather, to inquire, to look for, should you have someone in front of you experiencing crisis. So again, though I come from the VA hospital, this information can be generalized to our community. Wanting to point out that suicide is a very, very intense topic. So if at any moment here today you feel the need to take a breath, to take a moment, I encourage you to do so. Also here on the screen, there are a few different resources. In the event you should find yourself needing to speak to somebody, we do have a crisis line out of, Goodhue County. We also have our national crisis line. And so a few resources, again, in the event you're seeking additional support. So my hope here today, and I jumped ahead, and I'm going to condense it here just a bit, as I do recognize you guys are meeting and have stuff to, cover at the end, but again, wanting to just share the prevalence of suicide in our community. Then diving into having that hard conversation, right? What do we need to look for? What are those warning signs? Those things we could hear or see that could indicate somebody's experiencing crisis. What increases somebody's risk for crisis? Because every single one of us has stuff on our plate that could impact, that could increase our risk for crisis. And then what do we do should we encounter somebody in crisis? What are the resources available to us? What is the information we need to seek so we can provide that support? So our time is condensed, I know that, and so I want to make sure that when I walk out the door today, if you have questions, if there's comments, don't wait till the end to ask those. Chime in, ask those questions, make those comments. So when I walk out the door, you weren't like, shoot, I wish I would have asked this, or I wish I would have said this. Just by a show of hands, who's been impacted by suicide?
What?
Who's been impacted by suicide? If you've been impacted? Yeah. Okay. I know us as a community has been impacted. I know that through my work, and then I also just know, right, is the information that is put out into our community. Our Cannon Falls community has been impacted. And so we have all been impacted. And this information that I share here today, I really hope that not only it helps you, but that you'll take it with you. That there'll be nuggets that you'll take with you, that you can share with others. It's the job of all of us to have these conversations when we see somebody struggling. So what I want to point out here on this screen is for every death by suicide, we know that there are 135 people impacted by that death. So that could be immediate family, extended family, law enforcement, EMS, who show up on scene when that call is made. Us as a community. There are 135 people impacted by every death by suicide. So we also recognize that if we have been impacted by suicide, that it's important that we are also connected, that we receive that support. Because if we have been impacted, our risk for suicide also increases. We know that for our veterans, the risk for suicide is 1.5 times that for the general population. It is the 13th leading cause of death.
Location updated.
Now, also wanting to note that when we're looking at the means for suicide, the method that people are choosing, firearms is the most commonly used method. 70% of our veterans who die by suicide used a firearm. Over 50% of our general population used a firearm. You cannot unfire a firearm. 90% of those injuries are lethal using a firearm. So in the facility at the VA, we do focus a lot on lethal means safety. And so creating barriers between someone who's experiencing crisis and the lethal means to killing themselves. So giving out gun locks, giving out medication lock boxes. We know that if we can create barriers, that we can increase prevention. Now, again, wanting to move ahead a bit just because I want to make sure that we really engage in the discussion here, meats and potatoes, before I am on my way. But wanting to, really look at what increases somebody's risk for suicide. Why do we have this conversation? Because every single one of us has stuff on our plate. Every single one. And so what increases somebody's risk for suicide? What is that stuff that we're navigating that could increase somebody's risk for suicide? I have a few on the screen, but I'm just curious if you have any thoughts. We know that age increases risk. Any thoughts on why that is? Go ahead, yeah.
Probably.
I'd be looking at nursing home, for example, and the cost of nursing home. And perhaps looking at that as a way of avoiding it.
Okay, so nursing homes, and so when we get to the point of having to evaluate, right, is it time for a nursing home? Likely, right, has our health status changed, right, our level of ability? Absolutely. If we moved into a nursing home, right, taken from that independence that we once had, yeah, go ahead, John.
I was gonna say, health issues would play a big part of it, probably as you get older, yeah.
I'm sorry, John, could you repeat?
Health issues
Health
All
issues,
kinds.
yeah,
as you get older.
yeah. Go ahead.
I have been becoming more aware of how society puts older people in a certain category. A, you're not the valuable person you once were. B, you are not as smart as you once were. There's so many things that lessen your value.
As you age, is what you're, okay, yeah. Go ahead.
Pain,
Pain, yes.
because you have so many people with cancer and stuff. I've known this because a brother had it. And at the end, he didn't commit suicide, but he was very kind of conscious of the pain.
Yes. And pain is one of the most common risk factors, warning signs, right, when it's not managed, that we encounter for our veterans, and I would say for general population. If your pain is not managed, what is your quality of life looking like?
Not good.
Yes. And when we're navigating a lot of that pain, there are many of us, right, where that's kind of our reality now, and that's what the rest of life is going to look like. So to imagine, is this what the rest of my life is going to look like? Do I want to wake up in misery every single day? Thank you. We know, and I had talked about, lethal means. If we have access to lethal means, our risk increases. So if we have access to firearms, if we have access to excess medication, we have access to sharp objects, a rope, right? I mean, if we have access to lethal means, our risk increases. And that's why it's so important, and we'll get here, is when we recognize that somebody's in crisis, seeking out, do they have access to lethal means? Because if we remove that access, we create barriers to that access, that increases prevention. Go ahead.
I'd add cars,
Cars, absolutely.
because I know two people I worked with that they just wrapped themselves in blankets around the exhaust pipe, and that was it.
Absolutely.
I didn't suspect either one of them was that.
Thank you. And that's where I think, right, those questions are so important, right? And if we recognize or if we see warning signs, we know people have stuff going on, asking those questions. Because I too worked with a veteran middle age who died by suicide via his motor vehicle. And he crashed his motor vehicle with the intention of dying, and he died. And we do see, we have those coming into our inpatient unit at the hospital or calling into the crisis line who report, I'm driving 90 miles an hour, 100 miles an hour, these high rates of speed, not wearing a seatbelt, right, driving recklessly. I don't care if I live or die. So yes, seeking out and learning, how would you kill yourself? Have you thought about what you would do? Thank you. We know substance use. Right, if we're under the influence of alcohol, other substances, that increases our risk. We are not thinking rationally when we're using. What about protective factors? So these are the things that really mitigate our risk, help us through when we have all that stuff on our plate. What do you guys do for enjoyment or stress relief Have a beer, yeah. But I also think, right, to have the insight and self-awareness, right? I mean, to have a beer, enjoy a beer or two is one thing, right? But when we're drinking to access, and are we drinking as a means of coping, right? I mean, that looks different, absolutely.
And a computer.
Computer, yes. Gathering such as this, you're getting out and you're engaging socially. Coming together, right, bettering the community. These are all things that mitigate risk. Do we have that person that we feel connected to? And it might be one. Are we connected to care? Are we engaged in healthcare? Maybe it's just your annual, right? But are we engaged in care? That is absolutely a protective factor. So I had shared this, already, but looking at the lethal means, right? And so the method in which somebody dies. And so we know that firearms, it's the most commonly used method. So, a side note, and I didn't bring any, gun locks with me today, right? But if that's something that, you guys would like to have, or maybe you specifically, you want one in your possession, or you know somebody, maybe your son, your grandson, your neighbor, that we could get a gun lock into their hands, that's going to increase prevention. And also, right, reckless, unnecessarily, right, reckless behavior. Being mindful of where is that firearm storage? Is stored? Is it just laying out? Is your gun safe locked? So being mindful about the way that we're storing lethal means. We know that suicidal crises are brief. And so what do I mean by that? What you see on this screen is that there were interviews done with those who had attempted suicide. So those who had engaged in a behavior with the intention of dying, but they survived. They inquired, right, how long was it from the time you made that decision, you were thinking about suicide, you made up your mind, you were going to act, till the time you acted. You will see that nearly 24% said it was less than 5 minutes from the time they said or made up their mind, I am going to kill myself, until the time they acted, it was less than 5 minutes. Moving over to the right, nearly 50% said it was less than 20 minutes from thought to action. 71% said it was within an hour from the time they had their mind made up until the time they acted. So why is that important? Any barrier that we can create to get them through that short term, that hump, is going to help us increase prevention. Is the gun in a gun lock? And so I have thoughts of suicide, but I'm upstairs in my kitchen, and I have thoughts of suicide, but my safe is down in the basement. As I'm making my way down into the basement, right, to get into my safe, there's a knock at the door. I see a picture of my grandson on the wall. My phone rings. We know that these crises are brief, and so any barriers that we can create are going to increase prevention. Now, I'm curious your thought on this statement, that suicide is preventable. What is your thought? It's a hard one. And we probably have many thoughts. And those can differ depending on, right, the impact that we have. I do think, though, that there are many things that we can do with that person in front of us that we are worried about. I also recognize, in speaking reality, that we will not be able to prevent every suicide. It is a choice. It's a sad choice, right? Devastating, heartbreaking on every level. The devastation is wide. A choice that's made when someone is not well. But I do believe, as I said, there are many things we can do to help prevent in that person in front of us. And that's why we have these conversations. So we recognize when we see this, or we see that, or we hear this, we've got that gut icky feeling in our stomach that that person's not well. that we know how to have that hard conversation, that we can sit in that space and hear their story, and then we then know what resources exist to get them connected to. Go ahead.
I have a question. They always say that if somebody talks about it all the time, they're not going to do it. Do you find this to be true, or the threatening back?
Good question, and actually I jumped ahead. I actually had that on one of my
Oh,
slides.
sorry.
No, thank you. And so it's been heard, right, that people that talk about suicide don't really mean to do it. I would say that there are those who have talked about it who have no intention of dying. But if you are talking about suicide, you are not well. I think that is bottom line. If you are talking about suicide, you are not feeling well. Attention seeking or not. Do I not have the skills? Do I not know of any other way for you to hear me? And so instead, this is how I have to speak. We also know that in those who die by suicide, the majority of them endorse some sort of warning sign. Of course, there are those where maybe there wasn't a warning sign. But majority do endorse a warning sign. And so was that warning sign, in fact, that maybe they brought up the topic. I say that if someone is talking about suicide, we never take that lightly. We create the space for the conversation every time. If we are talking about suicide, we are not feeling well. Thank you. If somebody really wants to die by suicide, there's nothing we can do. That goes back to that statement that suicide is preventable. I do believe there are many things we can do with the resources that we have. And I think one of the biggest questions at the end of the day or at the end of that interaction, that I do all that I could, right, with the resources that I had available. What's your thought on this statement? Asking someone about suicide will plant the seed. Asking somebody about suicide may lead them to act. No, this is a myth. If you are asking the question, are you thinking about suicide? Do you want to kill yourself? You have likely seen something, heard something, have that gut icky feeling in your stomach that something is not right. If you are asking that question, the thought isn't going to just automatically pop in. For many, they're going to sense a sense of relief. We are scared to have this conversation. We don't want to talk about it either because of our own thoughts, our own biases, right? But they deserve to be asked that question. As long as we tuck it under the rug, we avoid the conversation, we're contributing to that. By asking that question, you're creating the space for them to open up and talk about their struggle. Go ahead, John.
I've said this before at the other programs you put on, that it makes you uncomfortable to ask that question. So how do you break the ice to do that? I find that very difficult. I don't know about the other people in here.
Yeah. And so recognizing, right, it is a very hard question to ask. It's scary, it's an uncomfortable topic. How do we break the ice? How do we start that conversation? We're going to get there in just a moment. All right, so meat and potatoes, VA SAVE, an acronym. Signs, ask the question, validate, and then either encourage or expedite getting that person help. These are the steps that we want and encourage you, the information we encourage you to seek out if you have concern that somebody might be experiencing crisis. So let's dive in. The signs. Some of us raised our hands that we had been impacted by suicide, but I think that everyone would raise their hand if I asked the question, have you ever known someone to struggle? I mean, have you ever known someone to have a bad day? So when we're struggling, when things aren't going well, what might we see? What might we hear? What are some of those red flags that could indicate someone's experiencing crisis? What are your thoughts? Of course, if someone is directly verbalizing it, right? I mean, that would be a warning sign. But oftentimes, our warning signs are more indirect. Expressing hopelessness. There's no way out. They're in the bottom of this deep, dark hole and there is no light. It's never going to get any better. I've tried everything. There's no other option. Anxiety, agitation. Oftentimes we think, that people act on thoughts of suicide as they're navigating a depression. But what do we know when we're in the throes of depression? Energy, motivation, drive. Many of those things are absent or lacking. So paying attention to absolutely that mood, but also being mindful and looking for that anxiety and that agitation. We also know that for depression, right, maybe we see more tears and sadness in women. But we know that it manifests more likely as anger in our male population. Go ahead.
The person that I know the day before
Mm.
he committed suicide called all of his business friends.
Yes.
And the following day, he sat down with his tax return and wrote out a check and sealed it in an envelope and then shot himself.
Wow.
Because he didn't think he had any money to cover that check.
Oh my. Mm.
And he did. He had a lot of ownership in companies around the area.
Wow.
Even was the president of one of
Mm.
them.
Wow. And so, looking there is at a warning sign, right? I mean,
The people that he talked to
yes.
said they thought there was something
Mm.
different about his tone of voice and what he was talking about, but none of them gave any consideration to suicide.
Yes. Wow. Mm. And I think it's hard, right? I mean, going back and it's, I saw this or maybe I saw that. But I think that's just another reason why it's so important that we have these conversations, because I think there's many people who never would have thought suicide. And so having these conversations, recognizing, right, the reality of and the impact that it has on our community, so we feel comfortable enough to ask that question. Thank you for sharing. And when we see the signs, we ask the question. When we know someone is struggling, we ask the question. And I encourage you to be direct in your questioning. Are you thinking about suicide? Do you want to kill yourself? Versus, do you want to hurt yourself? Have you had any thoughts of harming yourself? The outcome is very, very different. Are you thinking about suicide? Do you want to kill yourself? I'm really worried about you. You sound different. What's going on? And as John had mentioned, right, it's hard to start that conversation. And I think to state that, I'm scared to death. I don't know what to say. But I'm worried about you. Something's off. I can feel it. What's going on? And you might not be able to right off the bat get to that direct question, but to create that space. Be human. Let them know you're scared. Let them know you care about them. And once you've asked that question, we create the space to hear their story. We get comfortable with silence. It's not easy to come out and say, yeah, I've been struggling. And yeah, I've thought about killing myself. And so to create that space, to give that time for them to share their story, as they will sense your genuine concern. Validate their experience. This isn't a time, right, where we're asking all sorts of questions, where we're offering input, we're offering advice. This is a time to listen. And I really encourage you, if you can't do the listening, that you get that person to somebody that can. The thoughts didn't come on overnight. It's likely compounded. Suicide is complex. And so they might not come right out and share all the details in that initial moment. You might have to sit back and listen for a bit. And so if you have somewhere to be, if you can't engage in that conversation, I really encourage you to get another friend over, get a family member over. Don't leave them alone. Create the space for them to open up. Now, when talking with someone, right, who's experiencing a crisis, easier said than done, but really trying to be, right, as calm as we can. Also recognizing, scary, right? This person I love and care about in front of me is struggling, and I'm worried about their safety. Say it. Let them know. They are going to sense your genuine concern. I don't believe there's a right or a wrong thing to say. I do believe, though, that when we create the space, they're going to feel it. And as we hear their story, with the information that they share, we have to determine, do we just encourage that they connect with somebody for help? Or are we worried that if we walk away, that they could be a safety risk? And do we instead need to expedite getting them care? And where I think, the most important thing here is go with your gut. I'd say it's better to be safe than sorry. Also recognizing, right, based on that person, engagement with law enforcement can be scary, right? Does someone have a history of trauma, right? Could that damage a rapport? Could that damage a relationship? Absolutely. But I also have to say that if you have any concern for someone's ability to stay safe, don't do it by yourself. We have a county crisis line in Goodhue County. There's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. There are resources that we can utilize. Get a friend of yours, get another family member. The more eyes, the better. Now here in town, I'm thinking specifically, right, we have the ER here in Cannon. We don't have mental health, I'm pretty sure, on site there, or maybe they contracted out, but I know we have, right, mobile crisis. We've got the crisis lines. Law enforcement can come on scene. Making sure that we're aware of the resources, so if we have concern for somebody, that we can connect them to the resources. Who is aware of the crisis line? Is anyone aware of the crisis line in here? It's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, as well as the Veterans Crisis Line. Yeah. And so the number here on the screen, it's 988. For the general population, you dial 988 and they send you on through. Now when you call, if you're a veteran or supporting a veteran, right, then you can press 1 and they'll transfer you to one of 3 veteran call centers. They don't have to be on the verge of suicide for you to call. If you have any concern, please reach out, have a conversation. They'll guide you, they'll provide resources. Go ahead, Jen.
Regarding those numbers, say somebody, if you're in Goodhue County, which one would you call first? 911 or 988?
If you have concern for acute safety, if we have concern for safety in this moment, you call 911. If it is, I have concern, I'm starting to recognize maybe some warning signs, I'm concerned this person could be experiencing a crisis, I'd say you could start with the crisis line. Any concerns for safety, I'd say you're going to call 911. Any questions or any other thoughts on that one? Wanting to be mindful of time. I've got to rock and roll here. So, to wrap up, if you want further discussion, right, if there's further information that's desired, if you want to reach out to me afterwards, please, reach out. I encourage you to do so. If you have further questions, maybe there's a specific person you want to talk about, holler, that's why I'm here. But again, the signs, the pieces of information we want you to be, to remember, to keep at the forefront of your mind are those warning signs, the red flags. Maybe you can't pinpoint exactly what that is, but you have that gut icky feeling in your stomach that something's off. I'm worried about this person. Ask the question. Are you thinking about suicide? I'm worried about you. Have you had any thoughts of suicide? And then we validate their experience. We hear their story. We sit back and listen. And with that information, right, we encourage they connect for some more support, or we're calling 911 because we're worried about safety. We're bringing them to the emergency department. We are not leaving them alone. So what I can do, I can make sure that John has access, to the PowerPoint if that's desired. But just really quick here, a few resources, 988, which we talked about, the crisis line, Goodhue County or Southeast Regional Crisis. The number here for our local crisis line is on the board. Let's see here. I'm going to be mindful of time. Make the connection. So if we're looking specifically at our veteran population, or you support a veteran, this is a wonderful site. Oftentimes when we're in the throes of crisis, right, it can feel as if we're isolated, we're navigating that stuff by ourselves. And so Make the Connection is a wonderful resource, very much recovery-based, sharing stories of vets, family members of veterans who have navigated the throes of crisis, and who are here to share that they've come out on the other side and there is hope for recovery. So this website's nice because it's organized by era served, branch of the military, condition in which they're struggling with. And so to feel less isolated, to feel as if, right, I'm not alone in my struggle. If you have any desire for gun locks, medication lock boxes, any of that, please feel free to reach out and I'll make sure to get some of that into your hands. And also wanting to point out too that every single one of our facilities does have a LGBTQ plus array of services. As we know, that is not a risk factor for suicide, but some of the stuff, unfortunately, that the population has to navigate, right? The stigma, the harassment, right? Being part of a disenfranchised population, that could increase somebody's risk. So making sure that that support is out there and known. Multiple apps, right? As we are all very much technology-based. And there's a new safety plan app. Make note of this. Safety planning is a best practice for suicide risk. Having that conversation about if you do encounter yourself in crisis again, what are you going to do? What resources are available? Who can you reach out to? So when you do encounter the throes of crisis, you already have a plan to navigate. Lastly, if you guys are wanting any more of the VA Save training, there is a 30-minute training here at Psych Armor. So if you wanted to go back through or listen to these pieces again, Psych Armor is where you would find it. So as I wrap up here, really what can you do? Don't stop the conversation here today. Continue the conversation. Be on the lookout for the warning signs. Be that person that creates that space for that person struggling to share their story. Ensure you are aware of the resources and getting those who are struggling to connect in. Any questions?
Yeah, I have.
Go ahead, Rosie.
Have there been any studies done on people who have considered suicide but decided not to? And why? What affected them? Why did they choose not to?
I would say there is likely, right, I'd have to get back to you specifically, but yes. And I can say, and there was actually a number in there too earlier about suicide attempts. So 90% of those who survive a suicide attempt do not go on to die by suicide. So very similar to, right, what are those protective factors, those things that keep us living,
Right.
that keep us resilient, yeah.
Because it's not easy.
No.
Okay, what about with Canada? I understand one of the top reasons for a death is assisted suicide.
Assisted suicide.
So euthanasia, whatever you want to call it. So if that is prevalent
Yeah, and I mean, they say, some of the numbers out there is they say that like 90% of those who die by suicide had a diagnosable mental health condition. So what about that other 10%? Is often where we see that.
That's where you see that.
Yes.
Okay.
And so is that this pain? Right? I mean, they know there's been the extensive conversations, the research, all of that, and ultimately, yes, that is the decision that I have been made. Dying with dignity is sometimes what it's called, yeah. Mhm.
Well, thank you.
Thank you all for having me here today, and please don't stop the conversation. Continue to speak about this.
John?
We all have a job to do. Go ahead, John.
Just gonna mention everybody, this is the third program we put on in Cannon Falls now. We did this program in October with the VFW and American Legion. We had the meeting in our post. We had about 20+ people there that night. Julie did the program, by the way, and November we did one at St. Ansgar's in our adult forum, and we had 20+ people there. And now we've done it for 10 more people, so Julie, we've touched 50
Yes.
in Cannon Falls.
Mhm.
Also, I was gonna mention that a couple other professional agencies that come into the picture here too are the police people, such as the folks we have here. This could affect them greatly. And the fire department, firefighters that have permanent, full-time firefighters, we're talking not volunteer people like we have, but those are a couple of the groups that this really affects. And also, I was gonna mention Josh Smith, who is involved with this program through Goodhue County. And we can get materials if you guys would like for me to contact, or Julie could. Josh couldn't make it today, he happened to hit his full staff meeting, right?
He did.
He had to be there, so he couldn't come today, but he's the one that has all the things, the handouts. And I could get those and leave them here at the senior center for everybody to pick up if you'd like me to get some of those, like the gun locks and, name some of the other things, Julie, that.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot of, like the paper handouts too of the crisis resources, right, that you can keep, to hang on your fridge, put in your wallet. Yeah, so just a lot of that, the hard material.
So my point is, if other groups in Cannon Falls would like to hear this program touch a few more people, contact Julie or myself or Josh, and we could help you get that set up.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. We appreciate that. Okay, and then we'll go into our meeting.
Let's give Julie a round of applause.
Oh.